Welcome to The Last Picture House, the show devoted to discussion of classic films. My name's Marcus Lovett, and I'm joined by Dai, It's Alive Lynch, Maria, Beware the Moors Suzuki, and Iain, 'Twas Beauty That Killed the Beast Norton. This episode, Monsters as Metaphors. We'll examine 3 films that speak to our fascination with supernatural beings, whether they be oversized reptiles come to destroy us, people like ourselves becoming the other, or reminders of our own inhumanity. We'll dissect the recent Godzilla, King of the Monsters, fillet John Landis' American Werewolf in London, and dismember Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water. And if you enjoy the show, please remember to subscribe on iTunes, podcast player, or your preferred podcasting app. Monster movies have existed just about as long as cinema itself. Often, these early films were adapted from mythology or from popular folk tales. Stories of unnatural creatures with supernatural powers continue to draw audiences to this day. Maria, as our resident classics major, tell us a little bit about monsters in Western mythology.
I think that it would be easier to start with an example. One of the probably best known mythological monsters, the Minotaur, which is half a man and half a bull. So if we see at its origin, it's the offspring of the Queen of Crete and a bull. But if we go back to the story, this bull was supposed to be sacrificed to the god of the sea, Poseidon, but Minos, the king of Crete, decided to keep it. And he thought that...
As a pet.
Apparently it was a beautiful bull, so he was like, it's a pity to sacrifice it. And the god will never know the difference. But obviously gods know everything, so very angered, Poseidon made a trick to make his wife madly in love with the bull. And so the Minotaur was born. And this element tells you what's inherent to the monsters. It's the element of punishment first. So this Minotaur was obviously ashamed for the king, so he wanted to hide it, and he made maids so that nobody could find it. And every year he would be fed on human sacrifices, and the kids from various cities in Greece would just wander in the maze and be eventually found and eaten alive by the Minotaur. So eventually the son of the king of Athens kills it. And this is the second element. So the monsters are in some way functional to build up heroes.
So they exist essentially for heroes to have something to overcome.
Yeah. So they're very functional to creating heroes and strictly related to humans in the mythological world.
And Iain, for monsters to exist, first there has to be an agreement that there's such a thing as normal, right? How do stories of monsters help us question our prejudices?
First of all, we have to accept there's not really anything as easy as normal. All our behaviors are on a kind of a spectrum. But I think the one thing that's equally terrifying and reassuring is that we are smack bang in the middle of the bell curve ourselves. And I think because of the mundanity of most of our lives, not to depress our listeners, and that's why we do seek escapism and entertainment, and especially that fascination we have with the abnormal comes out in the popularity of monster movies. They are the kind of mirror to our normality. They show us this fear, acceptable fear, I guess, of the abnormal. They act as kind of metaphors or more spotlights for the prejudice that sit around all of us. But they help us not just question, but kind of re-examine perhaps the prejudice or the fears we have. With all of that said, though, I've seen your internet history, and that is not normal. And we will be touching on that again, listeners, when we talk about Shape of Water.
Dai, you're clearly a fan of the movie genre. What's the attraction of the monster movie?
It's a monster. It's a horrible, horrible creature. It's doing something horrendous. It's usually stomping on people and doing horrible things. And it's a fascinating thing to just watch and see and sort of revel in that pure, unadulterated terror. As I've gotten older, the interest has sort of changed to the more esoteric and the more metaphorical, like we're going to be talking about with this podcast, and sort of understanding the messages and the sort of the meaning and the coding behind these creatures and what they mean to us as people and to us personally, but also to us in the wider sense of our culture.
So something I wanted to ask you is, what separates a monster movie from a typical horror movie?
I think there is an element of nature about a traditional monster. I mean, if we look at Frankenstein, it's going against nature in a way. If we're talking about horror films, we're talking about societal-based things. It's usually a monster born from society. With the slashers, they're usually elements of people who are shunned, the outsider. The outsider of the monster is like the physical outsider, as opposed to the sort of the mental outsider. So I think there's a distinction that's to be made between.
Oh, you mean like physically unnatural or
Yeah.
ugly or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can pull Swamp Thing into that, or Frankenstein, like as we say. But there's a definite distinction.
So do you think that monster movies are a subgenre of horror movies, or do you think they're a genre all to themselves?
Well, I think there's enough of a history there for monsters and horror movies to be completely separate and distinct entities in and of themselves. But that's not to say there's not a lot of crossover. Cross-pollination is there, and in fact, you get the most interesting films when you do have those elements sort of crashing together, like The Host, I guess, or even Train to Busan. If you go back to the original Godzilla or Gojira film, it's very much of its time, but it's this element of the horror of the esoteric and the monster.
Well, let's talk about that now. So, Gojira, the 1954 film, was a milestone of how Japanese pop culture came to terms with the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The film tells of a giant creature that comes out of the ocean, a result of American nuclear weapons testing. It's seemingly unstoppable, and Gojira, of course, goes on to lay waste to Tokyo. The first film in what became a lengthy Japanese franchise, I think it still holds up, largely because it asks questions that are still relevant today. What happens when man plays God? What role does Japan play in the global balance of power? And how much trust should we put into governments when faced with disaster? Dai, there are more than 30 Godzilla films. How did the Japanese series stay relevant?
Yeah, we're talking about 50 years worth of films here. I feel like Godzilla is more about what happens when humanity is left untamed and is left to run amok, and what are our own restrictions, and what happens, and where do we bear our own responsibility for our own actions. The imagery in that film is Japan coming to terms with these elements at a time when they weren't even allowed to address them in a direct manner. Godzilla's, his matted skin and his body are the literal scars of nuclear holocaust. In a way, the franchise has evolved into more complex things. It's broadened its scope, how we've changed the planet. And so it's this sort of mutation of the core message, but at its heart is, how do we deal with something horrible that's happened, and what do we do next with it?
Iain, does the series work as a critique of the nuclear age?
I mean, I think the original does. And I think that's something perhaps many viewers missed on the first time around, because the version we got in the West was heavily edited. And it was only recently we got to see the original cut. In the original, yes, it's kind of a melodrama, it's much slower, but it is a critique of not just the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's also the fire bombings of Tokyo, and even Lucky Dragon number 5, the Japanese fishing boat that was caught in the US testing of bombing in Bikini Atoll. So I think it does show the effects, as Dai eloquently explained, of when man is allowed to play with these godlike weapons, the nuclear weapons. But I'm not sure if you could kind of argue that the rest of the franchise kind of keeps doing that. I think when we're up to the point where it's Godzilla versus Frankenstein, and Frankenstein's a caveman, that we're quite critiquing US foreign policy at that point. Although we might be, maybe I'm missing the point. And let's not get into the Hollywood films. That's a separate round.
Yeah, I think we can actually make a separation between the Hollywood series and the Japanese series for sure.
But I would argue that something like Shin Godzilla is back in that canon. It's maybe looking at a different type of nuclear threat, but that is back in the... Satirical is perhaps a bit too weak a word for it.
Well, I think it's a satirical.
I think Shin Godzilla is, but I don't think you would argue that the first Godzilla is a satirical film.
No, but they've taken the elements of the Godzilla myth and then made a working satire out of it.
I love Shin Godzilla. I think it's thick of it meets Godzilla. It's great.
All those committee meetings. And then they have to move from one meeting to another meeting room just because.
I would watch Malcolm Turco versus Godzilla.
Actually, I was relieved to see that Japanese do realize the irony of the politics, of the impossibility to move because there's bureaucracy, that there's hierarchy. I was like, oh, so people do realize it here when I saw Shin Godzilla.
While we're on the subject of Shin Godzilla, I mean, what for me it's taking down is the bureaucracy we saw so clearly after Fukushima. The long table full of experts where a question was asked to one particular panelist, could you explain what's going on? And then it had to be passed down the table to the expert in that thing and then passed back to another expert for the next step. So you had 12 people explaining every single issue.
Yeah.
And the bureaucracy was so obvious to the world at that point.
Yeah,
so
and
I think the
especially-
film's really about that.
And especially the priority is not the safety of the population, it's just for the prime minister not to lose face.
A friend back home had watched Shin Godzilla, but he's never lived in Japan. And he said one of the bits that he found really odd, this is really specific, he said that he didn't think the physical tables in the meetings, you're like, why did they look so cheap? Why were they not, why was it not more filmic, or why was it more...
Exactly.
But I was like, no, that's hit it, the nail on the head. That's exactly what those rooms would look like and those tables would look like. And I thought it was a wonderful satire on modern Japanese politics, but also a little bit on society, because the only role in there that didn't ring true was the strong female that spoke English.
Who was put there because we need a strong female lead. Otherwise, it's going to look bad.
A strong, pretty female as well.
Maria, how representative of Japanese culture is Godzilla?
Godzilla, I think, is fairly representative of Japan on so many levels. First of all, the origin of Godzilla, I think it can be traced in the Japanese folklore. In the spirits and the creatures, they are called yokai. There are usually these creatures, not all of them big, but a lot of them are huge creatures that terrify entire villages. I'm thinking of one which is the giant spider called Tsugumo, which I think lives in one of the enemies or one of the allies of Godzilla. It's a representation of big diseases or natural disasters. And on the other hand, I think it's very representative of post-atomic Japan. We were talking about the keloid scars, but not just that. It's what I found really enlightening was reading a book that was kind of a Bible to prepare for this podcast, because I'm not really a kaiju expert. Jason Barr's The Kaiju Film. He related what pop artist Takashi Murakami, whom you may know as the guy who does the giant flowers. He said that his art is really a product of post-atomic bomb in Japan, because on one side you have a very childish imagination. So you have the Pokemon aspect, but you also have the deformed aspect that can lead to kaiju. And I think it's not a coincidence that Godzilla is also a very powerful character that's given birth to a big merchandise that also covers the kawaii, the cute.
Dai, countless Hollywood films have borrowed from the source material, and they've shown the White House being destroyed in Independence Day, uncontrollable creatures of devastating power laying waste to cities. Why do filmmakers keep going back to the Japanese original?
I think the metaphor is the strongest there. It's the clearest. Godzilla himself, his character, which would later grow on to be sort of the defining attributes of him as not only monster but also a savior. That isn't necessarily true in the first film. In the first film, he is just pure destruction. In the new Shin Godzilla, which is very much a reboot of the franchise, he is returned to that state. And maybe that's because we're talking about a country that's now dealing with the aftermath of natural disasters like Fukushima and all the rest of it. But he has changed and he's morphed. He's equal destroyer as he is savior. And I think we relate to him in a weird way. He's like, he might destroy, but he's not as bad as the other monsters.
So Dai, you were saying that Godzilla is now the symbol of tourism in Japan, the symbol of coming to Tokyo.
He's been that for a number of years. And I think that's indicative of the reach that this character has. He's not just a Japanese monster from the 50s. He's transcended. He means more now. He's one of those characters that can instantly be recognized, even from silhouette, and he's famous around the world.
So given that this character means so much to Japanese and to people in Tokyo in particular, what do Japanese audiences make of the new Godzilla film, the American version, King of the Monsters?
Well, I don't know if I can speak for Japanese audiences specifically, but I can say, having watched the film in Japan, I mean, it's a love letter to the old Japanese movies. More than it is to the American films. This is all of that craziness all balled up into one sort of CGI mess. And it's fantastic in many ways. It's tying into both the seriousness of Godzilla as a strong metaphor, but also, I mean, it's kind of having its cake and eating it a little bit, because it is putting those big monsters clashing together. And there are a lot of big moments in this film, and it's a lot of callbacks to many of the films that people love throughout the franchise.
Okay, so just for anyone unfamiliar with the new film, Dai, why don't you tee it up?
So this film, you kind of have to understand that we're dealing with one of Hollywood's now favorite things, which is the shared world universe. Marvel has shown the way, and you can't have a big movie franchise now without having some sort of connection to other films. So in these films, we are connected to the 2014 Godzilla, which was the first of this line of monster movies, and then there was Kong Skull Island, set in the 70s, and this is now the most recent one. So the connecting thread here is Monarch, which is the US secret agency, and they have been studying monsters, or titans as they call them, since the 70s, and maybe even longer, we're not sure. But they've been around for a long time, and in this film, we actually start right at the beginning, right at the end of the 2014 Godzilla, where we find our new characters, Mark Russell and Dr. Emma Russell, played by Kyle Chandler and Vera Farmiga. they are dealing with the loss of one of their children. And this tees up then the events of this new film. And what we are dealing with here is a planet, very much like our own planet, dealing with mass extinctions of species, climate change, and now these titans. And Charles Dance plays an eco-warrior whose plan is to release the titans to restore balance to the Earth.
As one does.
Well, why wouldn't you? I mean, it seems like a sensible plan to me. That's what I mean when I talk about
There's nothing very sensible
No, but
about
this is
this
what I mean
plan,
when I talk about the melodrama and the sort of sillier elements of it. And I understand, like, people struggle to get their head around it, and they struggle to see past the sillier elements. I can't get my head past the 1997 Godzilla, and I can't see past the melodrama there. But in this film, I find myself very willing to suspend my disbelief.
Do you think the new film is a worthy successor to what came before, either the Japanese series or the previous American films?
The thing is, I have a 2-tier rating system for Godzilla movies, which let me try and explain this to you. So, Godzilla 1954 is a stone cold classic. It's what I consider a hallmark of the monster franchise, but it's not only that, it's a good film. It's evidently and objectively a good film. I think you can put Shin Godzilla into that category as well. There are other second-tier Godzilla movies that are maybe not so good. Godzilla vs. King Kong. It's funny, it's fine, but I mean, it's stupid and it's silly, and I love it in a different way. King of the Monsters falls into that second category, even though I think it has some designs maybe, but I think the director, Mike Dougherty, might contradict me on that and say that he's just merely having fun. And it's a very, very good second-tier Godzilla movie.
How about you, Maria?
I have to be honest, I'm not a number one fan of the genre, and if I have to choose, I'm much more partial to the 1954 type of film. I love miniatures, so the first films, a lot of miniatures, a lot of rubber suits.
Stomping on models.
Stomping on models, yes, I'm much more that type of film person. For the specific film, the characters were not really speaking to me. I didn't care about any of the characters, including Godzilla, so I'm not the best person to ask.
And you, Ian?
To be honest, I really thought that before going to watch it, I'd be much more in Maria's camp for this. But we had a kind of last picture house outing. So I went with Dai to watch this at the Toho Cinema in Shinjuku, and we went and took selfies with Godzilla on the roof before we started. And honestly, Dai was so excited. It was like a kid in a candy shop. And to sit there watching it with someone that had so much invested and knew so much of the myth and the lore behind it, some of that excitement...
You were biased.
No, I think he infected me. I think it rubbed
Osmosis.
off. And because...
I did not rub off. How dare you?
We are back to Marcus's internet history in Shape of Water. I mean, he did.
Maria, what are the...
I haven't finished it.
Oh,
About halfway through, where it was very much, it turned into Independence Day, and the human characters, I couldn't care less. And I didn't mind seeing the big things hit the other big things with stuff. It was completely fine. And afterwards, I was so scared to say to Dai that maybe it wasn't the best movie in the world. But when we sat down and talked about it, he is right. It's a solid 3-star movie. I think it suffers because Godzilla himself is such a Japanese monster. And there's such 2 layers of subtlety or duality to Godzilla that I think that this film tries really hard to play homage to that and to the original movie itself. I just don't think that's something that Hollywood can do. I think he's so part of Japanese culture. That duality kind of just seems forced, or kind of seems a bit soulless when it played out in this film. But that's it. I enjoyed it, and watching Dai was lovely.
Dai, you have to admit that the whole thing feels kind of low stakes, right? If you're not invested enough in the characters, then it becomes spectacle.
Well, this is one of the things that I think the film actually has a major issue with, is the fact that, yes, in terms of the characters, it might feel low stake. It's hard because it's a family unit. It's brushing up against the Spielberg family and those things, which I do think is a conscious nod and call back to the 2014 film, which is doing the same thing.
Just to interrupt you there, the amount of time devoted to that is all of one scene. I mean, that first scene, and then everything until... Okay, in the first act, folks, I'm going to spoil it, but with the release of Mothra, that opening section is all we get. That whole thing is just one email, and then I'm worried about my mum. And that's all we get, as opposed to Roy Neary and Close Encounters, where it's pretty much the entire film up to the point where he leaves home.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you. I agree this is the weakest part of the film, and it is how these characters play off. And yeah, it is relegated to the second, it's almost a subplot in a way. You're right, it is a subplot. And this is what I mean about it being a weird combination of, yes, this is relegated to a subplot and it's a low-tier, second-rate thing, but at the same time, the stakes are weirdly high because the whole planet is involved in this. It's a global catastrophe. I mean, I want to know how they're going to build on, because Godzilla versus King Kong is coming in 2020, and there's like nothing left of the planet.
Well, my argument would be, if you have less Titans, then you're going to have more investment in what's going on. The more things you throw at the screen, this is my argument with the Avengers as well, the more characters you throw at the screen, the more bad guys you throw up there as well. You're just creating a cacophony and you don't have time to really concentrate on what's going on.
Yeah.
Now, I would rather see an American Godzilla film with Godzilla doing the damage and not have quite so many of the other Titans, and maybe spend a little bit more time on character development for the humans.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's kind of what I was expecting, the 2014 Godzilla. No one really expected the Mutos to be part of that. But maybe that's the American view of Godzilla, is that disaster element of him being a force of nature is specifically Japanese. It didn't really work in the Roland Emmerich movie. Yeah, I mean, arguably, he's relegated to a physical, actual creature in that, more than a monster and a metaphor. I feel like they wanted to have their cake and eat it in that film in 2014 because they wanted him as the monster, but they also wanted him as the savior. So they combined the two better elements. Essentially, Godzilla 2014 is two films in one, and they cover both ground. They do both things for him. It's a bit of a, it's just a bit of a mess with it. I agree that the monsters here, I wasn't expecting as many Titans as they had. They had 17. 17!
Yeah,
not all of them
it's a
fought.
lot.
I mean, you have the main ones. You got King Ghidorah, Monster Zero. You have Mothra, and you have Rodan. I thought that was going to be it.
Ian, has Godzilla lost any of its magic with the move away from the guy in the suit special effects?
I think King of Monsters plays quite a nice homage to the original guy in the suit in the final credits. It's Haru Nakajima was the original guy.
Yeah, he was the original
Man in the suit.
man in suit, yeah.
And I know Dai explained earlier, but one of the other reasons for putting Godzilla as a man in a suit was to add kind of a humanize Godzilla, to give him that duality. It's really easy to over-romanticize the guy in a suit, the kind of practical effects that were in the original Godzilla. But, I mean, part of the thrill of watching some of the early movies and even watching movies now is trying to work out how did they do that effect. And trying to work out how did they film that, how have they worked that out. When we first had the advent of CGI, and in something like Jurassic Park, where we had a mix of CGI and practical effects, that was breathtaking. But it's no longer breathtaking. It's now become the normal and the kind of the mundane. And films that kind of do retain those practical effects, like the Halo jump in the recent Mission Impossible. It's all that more impactful and more impressive for knowing that that's a practical effect. And if you can let me indulge me for a second to go back on brand as the music guy. If you look at Radiohead's video for No Surprises, where it's Tom York inside a fishbowl, and he sings the song as it fills with water. Now, if you've ever seen the making of for that video, he did take after take after take, and he refused to give up until he could do it. They told him, look, we can fix this in post, and he wouldn't do it. He had to do it in one take, and you can see on his face when the water finally drops, there's this kind of, he's trying to sing the song, but there's this kind of look of sort of elation. And I think that's what perhaps the audience get as well when you know it's a practical effect compared to CGI. Now, not to say CGI is bad, sorry, Stefan, we still love you. But there is a point where CGI, if it's in the wrong hands, it can be kind of soulless.
And by the way, if you're interested in behind the scenes about the first Godzilla, the interview of Haru Nakajima is available on YouTube, so please watch it, because it tells, first of all, the rubber suit was something like 100 kilo or something, and he was sweating all the way, and after like 6 hours take, he would finally be out of the suit, and I mean, he's not credited in the movie. And when he went to see the first film, nobody knew his face. So he went to see it in the front seat. And he was really happy to see that everybody liked the film. So I watched this interview and it was really moving. So I strongly recommend to see it.
Does it have English subtitles?
Yes, it has.
Great, let's put in the show notes.
Yes.
Another major theme within monster movies is that of mutation. Someone who's transformed against their will into the other, whether it be a vampire or a werewolf, or in the case of Peter Parker, an arachnid. And let's not forget everyone's favorite jazz pianist Jeff Goldblum getting the Cronenberg treatment in The Fly. The idea that humans aren't the masters of the universe, or even of their own bodies, has fascinated filmmakers since the early days of Hollywood. Why is that, Maria?
The theme of mutation has been explored in literature, in other arts, but I think on a visual level, idea of seeing the process of mutation has fascinated humanity, I think. You were mentioning Hollywood, so I'm thinking about something that's a little bit not about creatures, but it's about mutation, transformation, and is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That has an interesting history in the cinema of how filmmakers were putting that in image. It started out in the 20s with John Barrymore playing the protagonist. And it's interesting because it always starts with the hands. In the 30s, there was the most outstanding mutation filming in Hollywood, which was the 1932 Frederick March starring film. It was very interesting on a technical level because it was using a lot of polarizing filters. And if you see it now, you can really see a pretty good level of, without CGIs, of the process of transformation. This was so good that probably everybody remembers as a old Hollywood movie, the Spencer Tracy one. But the Spencer Tracy one from MGM, they were so afraid of being compared to the film that they bought the rights and practically they
buried it.
They buried it. So you cannot see it for more than 10 years. In that one, you see that it's practically shot-by-shot copy of the 1932 one. The Victor Fleming one is 1941. So I think that cinema is the art form that really deals with the obsession that we have to see the process of mutation. The reason for that is I think we all kind of always afraid of the monster inside, and this is really something that deals with it, to kind of exercise it.
Ian, you struggle to control yourself at the best of times.
Character assassination.
What does mutation have to say about our fears?
I wish I could argue with him as well, but given the evidence of last week at the Muteki's last show, I ended up shirtless, jumping around like a loon. Yeah, you may have a point. I was reading a great article on this topic from the Journal of Popular Film from 1973, and it argues that the enduring popularity of monster movies is due to the sexual trauma we all suffer in adolescence. It argues that the sexuality of monster movies is kind of uniquely tailored to the psyches of troubled adolescents, at whatever age those adolescents are. It's great. It says, like, in adolescence, we find ourselves trapped in this kind of unwilling change, movement from the security of childhood into this new sort of unsecure state. And with that, this kind of new state we have no control over. And it brings a physical changes, a kind of sprouting of hair, sexual impulses, and dark yearnings. As the article itself, it calls it aggressive erotic behavior. And I think, I just love that phrase.
Where did you find this?
It's brilliant. I'll put it in the show notes. But I think that's something you can see specifically in a movie like Teen Wolf, where his transformation is kind of a little bit against type. So he transforms into the wolf. He becomes the cool guy, the leader of the basketball team. But then he goes on a date with this girl. And while he's on the date, he gets a little excited and then the beast comes out. And then from then on, he turns into the kind of villain of the piece. So I think we see here the fear of the transformation is that what the individual's capable of what we could do, pushed to our edges. And also, we are now a generation of adolescents. Hollywood is movies made by adolescents for adolescents. So I think that enduring popularity is there may be something in this 1973 article. So
is the article saying that everyone has a troubled childhood? I didn't quite catch.
It's 1973, so it's incredibly Freudian for some reason, but it argues that we all go through this incredibly impactful event of adolescence, and it leaves us scarred, and then we need to find perhaps some resolution in our minds through watching monster movies.
So this is us trying to resolve something that happened to us in our early childhood that scarred us erotically.
I don't know where you are going to go.
I want to see where you're going to go, man.
Marcus, I feel like I'm the counselor here. Are you erotically scarred? But it is. I think that they are talking about the grotesque, and that transformation is into that grotesque. In that wonderful scene in American Werewolf in London, we do see is that transformation.
Excellent. That's just the lead-in I was hoping for. So let me explain the plot for American Werewolf in London. David and Jack are two American college students backpacking across the UK. One fateful night, the pair are attacked by a werewolf. Jack is killed and David is injured. David wakes up in a London hospital and appears to be making a full recovery when he's visited by Jack's ghost, who explains their attacker was a supernatural being and that David must kill himself to sever the werewolf bloodline and release victims from an eternity trapped in limbo. Maria, American Werewolf in London does a great job of highlighting how the two backpackers are outsiders. Following the attack, David becomes the ultimate outsider. Isn't this the point of the mutation theme?
Before answering the question, yeah, definitely being outsider, not just in the pub, but also in the metro with all the punks. It's really the epitome of being an outsider, the life of David in the UK. But going back to the mutation thing, it's a theme that's really global. We see the idea of being transformed into a wolf goes back to the Babylon era, if we research it. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a transformation in werewolf.
You just referenced Gilgamesh in a podcast.
Yes, I did. Guilty as charged. But Gilgamesh doesn't want to be the goddess Ishtar lover because he knows that she transformed a man who refused her into a wolf. And obviously we have the Greeks, but we also have other tradition. In Africa will be men transformed into hyenas, or in Japan it's foxes. The common ground is always a kind of punishment. It's something that's a curse. Some of these transformations are irreversible, but some of them are temporary. So that means that this going back and forth between a world of comfort, a world that the person is comfortable or maybe even privileged into a world of outsider, a world that maybe he sneered at, the world of animals.
It's kind of the in-group, out-group thing.
Yes.
So you're on the inside of the group, you belong to that tribe, and then suddenly you're cast out, and then you have to either fight your way back or it's a permanent change.
And suddenly you're an animal, so you're something that you never thought that you will be thinking as. And it's kind of a metaphor for a lesson of life and how to live in a different way. So the basis of many of these stories is how to break this curse, and it's kind of a path to enlightenment or being a better person.
It does make me think of those cowboy films, those stories, the true stories of people who are taken prisoner by some indigenous group, whether it's in the United States or in Australia, we have the same story. Somebody becomes part of that tribe only to then later on have an opportunity to escape. I'm thinking of the John Wayne film, by the way, and doesn't want to.
Just like Avatar.
Or even Last Samurai.
Dai, we have to talk about American Werewolf in London's famous transformation scene. Innovations in visual effects mean that filmmakers have almost unlimited resources now when it comes to creating a kind of transformation into a monster or into another type of creature. Does the bedsit transformation in American Werewolf still stand up?
For my money, yes. And I think that's a combination of elements that are down to the editing and the lead up to the scene, fueled by the performance by the actor. The body horror of it is put together, and it's a fantastic scene, and it's been aped, countless times throughout cinema. And I think it's down to the combination of Rick Baker's special effects with John Landis's eye for a shot, and also the humor. The humor is very prevalent in that scene. If you look at Rick Baker's history with special effects and movies,
that's one of his early films.
It is one of his early films, and it's funny if you look back at his filmography. Wolf and werewolves have cropped up every now and again. The last time I think he worked on a wolf film was the ill-fated Benicio del Toro Wolfman reboot for Universal, which didn't really get off the ground. But again, the special effects in that film are second to none. And Rick Baker has a really fascinating way of including body horror, a lot like Cronenberg does. It looks real. It looks like a physical thing that's happening. There are some wonderful moments of like gelatin skin being pulled and stretched, and it's the pain and the agonizing. Again, tying back into what Iain was talking about as a metaphor.
A lot of it's a performance.
A lot of it is a performance, but I think the metaphor is coming through there. Like transforming into an adult is a painful thing. Your body does things you don't want it to do, and that's obviously taken to the nth degree when your ankles are stretching into dog's hind legs. This is one of the first representations of a werewolf actually becoming a dog or a wolf-like thing. Wolfman is a bipedal. Wolfman is bipedal. He stands on two legs. American Werewolf in London, he is a wolf.
Yeah.
He is a wolf first. He loses his humanity entirely.
And the scene itself was grueling to shoot. It took 6 days to film just that transformation itself. But of those 6 days, it was ridiculous. It was 10 hours were spent on application of makeup, another 5 hours on taking the makeup off, and only 3 hours could be done on actually shooting. And Baker estimates they only got about half an hour of footage each day, and it was all done with kind of air pumps and rods, and it completely stands up.
I wonder if that was like second unit, or did Landis direct all of that himself? Was that done separately? I doubt it. I'm guessing that it was all hands-on by the actual director rather than a second unit director.
And I know Rick Baker himself, there's only ever been 2 werewolf films to win Oscars, and Rick Baker got both. Wolfman and American Werewolf in London both won for special effects.
The other amazing makeup in this is Griffin Dunn when he appears as Jack in the hospital. Both times we see him, first of all, in the hospital, and he's asking David to kill himself because Jack wants to get out of limbo. All of the people who are killed by the werewolf are now in this kind of purgatory world.
Approaching him, do you mind if I have a toast?
He eats some of his breakfast that David's refusing to eat.
Yeah, and it's the wonderful moment where all the people that David's killed on his killing spree are telling him all the inventive ways that he can kill himself.
Right. The makeup on Griffin Dunne when he first appears in the hospital is absolutely horrific. He's got like bits of latex, but this stuff hanging down, which is, I guess, what's left of his throat. I mean, it's really a gory film.
And it's the first scene is in broad daylight, so it could really go wrong. Like on a visual level, it could really look fake, but it doesn't.
Yeah, the other interesting thing about that scene is that I know Landis instructed Griffin Dunne to be really chipper, like be really happy. Don't play like there's something terribly wrong. Everything is just A-okay. It's just you're delivering these lines about, so David, you've got to kill yourself.
And I know that, you talk about the flapping skin around the neck. That was because it was so hot that the latex wouldn't stick, so it kept falling off. And they had to cut, there's a part of the movie where he eats the toast, and it falls through one of the holes in the neck, and they had to cut it to get their certification. It was seen as too grotesque.
That's awesome. So the film walks the line between horror and comedy. Ian, does it work?
I think when I saw it as a teenager, I didn't really get the comedy element. I thought it was kind of an odd tone that the film had struck, but I think that's perhaps, as I've grown up now, I can see that the comedy element works. I don't think it's kind of laugh out loud comedy. I think it's much more sort of funny and charming, kind of the same mold as like Shaun of the Dead or something like that. But I also don't think it was ever really intended to be a comedy. Landis himself apparently gets quite annoyed when people say it's a comedy. He said it's a horror, but it's a funny horror. But it's a horror. It's supposed to be scary and grotesque. I think the humor itself works really well because it's not used as the comic relief. It's kind of woven into the script. And it only works as part of the horror narrative because the horror itself stands up. The scene in the tube station where he's running away from the wolf, it's truly claustrophobic. We've all spent time in London tube stops, and at night they are scary places. And I think because the horror works so well, the comedy doesn't feel kind of added on. It feels part of the narrative itself.
I think it's one of the bleakest ending of a film. It left me quite shaken.
Yeah, it's up there with The Mist, which I think is the bleakest end to a film.
Maria, why haven't we had a female-led werewolf movie?
Movie, no, but literature, yes. There's a short story by a pulp writer called Manly Bannister, and it's called Ina. And it's a story about a she-wolf. And she escapes, grows up, and wants to meet the man who raised her. And she appears to him in the body of a woman that the guy falls in love with, but he doesn't know she's a werewolf, so he ends up killing her. The transformation scenes are very interesting because the transformation into human being are almost like orgasmic, but the going back to being a wolf are very painful.
I have to read this.
Yeah, I think you have to. I think it's on the internet. But movie-wise, you're right.
Everything's on the internet.
Everything on the internet. But movie-wise, you're right. Not yet. I think probably because this has to do with the male gaze on women body. There's still a lot of people, mostly men, but also women, that have difficulty accepting like facial or body hair with women. So there were a lot of campaigns that were trying to show that, and they received claims. So I think it has to do really with the traditional male gaze.
Mythic creatures, be they gods or monsters, have always been a way to rationalize sexual desire. It's a way to explore taboos and deliver moral values, while at the same time titillating audiences with often graphic stories of immorality. Maria, why don't you tell us a little bit about relationships between humans and immortals in mythology?
Well, if you, by immortals, you mean gods, the Greeks had no problem inventing stories between humans and gods. But if you involve like the animal factor.
The animal factor?
Yeah.
Tell us about the animal factor, Maria.
Well, if we think about the god of gods, Zeus.
That guy again.
That bad guy again. He wouldn't mind taking the shape of an animal to seduce men or women. So he would turn into a swan, he would turn into a bull, but that was just a temporary thing. But if you think about the proper creatures that we define as monsters, like half beast, half human, they were a little less lucky in the love department. So they're always doomed to be like solitary creatures. So I think that for the Greeks was probably the ultimate taboo. And in that sense, like the love stories between humans and monsters, it's much more of a product of a modern era.
Well, on that note, Dai, from Universal's Phantom of the Opera to King Kong, later Beauty and the Beast, Hollywood's always been fascinated by relationships between monsters and mortals. What do audiences relate to?
That depends on what actual metaphor we're talking about. If we're talking about something like King Kong and we're looking at the relationship between Kong and Andaro, then there are connotations there between masculine and feminine, but also animalistic and human, and also white imperialism and I guess ethnic and tribal. So there are really interesting elements drawn up throughout that film. If we're talking about something like the Phantom of the Opera, then we're looking at, I guess, more Western societies and the way that we're quite good at othering certain aspects or certain elements in our society.
Of our own society.
Very much of our own society, yeah. It's interesting to see how each of these films play with these. And they're never really that overt. And, I mean, some people may have sniggered at the relationship between King Kong and Darrow, but there's a purity to it on screen. And it's not played for laughs. It's played straight. It's the purity that the audiences latch onto. And I think that a lot of the way these films play around with these elements is really, really fascinating.
Iain, when it comes to this theme, there's always the group of the right thinking. You know, the townsfolk with the pitchforks, they refuse to acknowledge the possibility of relationships between humans and monsters. Is this just a trope, or does it say something important about how we treat those we don't understand?
I mean, for me, this is some of the most interesting parts of monster movies. It's how quickly the humans devolve into these kind of base stereotypes and fears. And I think it's not just a trope we see in monster movies, it's a trope we've seen throughout human history. And I think what's really interesting is when the hero group itself, they don't just other the monster, they other themselves within the group. They pick off the weakest as it goes through. And as I say, there's something we've seen in history, for example, in the Khmer Rouge, when they ran out of other people to other, they started to then other people on such arbitrary things as being
revolution eating itself.
Yes, yeah, them being left-handed or wearing glasses or being intellectuals. And you see that in monster movies, the weak get picked off. I think it's in Slither, where he says, oh no, I've seen this movie, the black guy dies first. And they'll use anything as a way to other people in it.
But I mean, there's historical antecedents for that.
Yes,
That's
of
what
course.
happens. That's what happens in societies where you need to keep finding a new enemy.
It's what makes the world go round.
And there's another element, which is a stereotype, but a stereotype that I don't have any problem with, which is always seeing the element of the woman as the bridge between the known and the unknown. The women are the only elements, creatures that dare go where other people are sneering at or don't want to or are afraid. And one film
so they're the ones that make a connection.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with this kind of stereotypes because I think women tend to be more curious, tend to be more the element that tries to find a communication. And one film that does this, but without the too much of a stereotype element, is Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water.
Why don't you set that up for us?
Okay. Baltimore, early 60s. Eliza, Sally Hawkins, works as a cleaner at a government lab where an aquatic creature captured in the Amazon is imprisoned and tortured by a ruthless agent, Michael Shannon. Wanting to learn about the lab's new asset, Eliza hides in the lab and befriends him. When Eliza realizes the government plan for the creature, she must summon courage she never thought she had.
So, Maria, did you buy the love story in The Shape of Water?
Well, actually, I did. Not in a way that I identify with it, meaning that I started looking at fish tanks with lust. But I think that those scenes when they're having like this rendezvous with boiled eggs and Benny Goodman, I think they could totally be like a workplace romance. And I think there's definitely chemistry between Eliza and the creature. But one of the elements for this is mostly because of the creature. And the creature inherits the element of a great movie that The Shape of Water owes to, which is The Creature from the Black Lagoon, a 1954 movie about a biologist expedition in the Amazon and this aquatic amphibian creature that tries to kidnap the female scientist. And actually, Guillermo del Toro saw this movie when he was 6, and he was enchanted by the scene. That's a beautiful scene because this movie was shot in 3D with this beautiful black and white.
Oh, it's in 3D?
It's 3D, yeah, it was shot in 3D. So they had to choose. They had to choose between color and 3D because they couldn't have both. So they decided to make it black and white, but shoot it in 3D. There's this scene where the creature is swimming underneath, and up there is Kay, the scientist. She's swimming, and he's looking at her with this longing, and he's almost like afraid to touch her. He reaches her, but he's afraid of like hurting her, and it's a magical moment. And
your interpretation, if I can just interject there, your interpretation is quite different to mine. I watched it recently as well in prep for the show. And my interpretation of that was it was a malevolent force. I saw it as something to be feared, and whether it was lust or whatever, it was negative for sure.
Well, you see, it's a different side of the feminine and the masculine.
You saw that as something that was reaching out to make contact.
Well, you see him like he can be very violent and just with one
the webbed hands. Yeah.
With one snap, he would kill people, and he's almost like
very convenient, by the way, with one webbed hand over a mouth, and this person would like fall down dead.
Yeah. But anyway, it's not just me. Also, Guillermo del Toro, when he was 6, he saw that as this possible love story, and he said that in interviews that he was expecting the happy ending. So he was very disappointed when the creature gets shot. And he promised himself that he would make a movie where Kay and the creature would end up happily ever after. And therefore, that's The Shape of Water.
It also has this fantastic character in the man, I think his name is Mark. He's the man who's willing to fund the expedition into the Amazon to go searching for these artifacts. And this is before they know that the creature is alive, that there's an actual living specimen. But they find these fossils, and he's willing to fund the expedition. As the movie plays out, we gradually realize that he's someone who's looking for more than just scientific knowledge.
No, he's just looking for personal achievement and things that he can show and things that he can get articles from for himself. So it's basically like a success-seeking man.
Right. And that sort of trophy hunter, that goes back to the kind of characters we talked about earlier, the people who refuse to see beyond their limited scope, that they've got a kind of a worldview, and everything outside that view, they're not willing to engage with it. So Mark in Creature from the Black Lagoon, there's a kind of connection here with The Shape of Water in Michael Shannon's character, Richard Strickland. We have to talk about Shannon's character because he's the government agent who captured the creature from the Amazon. And as far as villains go, he has to be one of the nastiest in recent cinema. He's someone who has a worldview and cannot see beyond it. Very much like Mark in Creature from the Black Lagoon. What makes him so memorable, Dai?
He does a fantastic job of sort of exuding this sort of menace.
Yeah.
And you can just hold a camera on him and he doesn't have to be doing anything. And you just think, he's going to do something and it'll be horrible. And I won't like it.
I have seen him in interviews where I saw one interview where he was sitting in a bar and I still felt like any moment he's going to grab a glass and smash it over someone's head.
Yeah, I guess we could call this the Joe Pesci effect, really, shouldn't we?
Too many times I've seen him play that role.
The difference with this one is that it's an arc. He starts nasty and he gets worse.
He gets nastier.
And he gets nastier. And I think this is really shown outwardly when he finally starts physically manifesting the inner monster, which,
right.
It's not subtle in any way, but his face gets messed up, and for a lot of the last act of the film, he's basically pinning his cheek together and stopping his
fingers.
He's reattaching bits of himself. I cringed more looking at him and what he was doing to himself, way more than I did with the monster and the sort of sexual elements. And I think this is very intentional, but it's down to his performance, really.
Well, you mentioned the sexual elements of the film. I guess you could say that the film had a mixed reception when it came out. I remember some critics falling in love with it, while other members of the Twitterati dismissed the film as a fish sex movie. Does the film condone bestiality, Iain?
Who doesn't, Marcus? No, I mean, in a way it does, but I think on the stuff as well, the Twitterati were offended and they do call it the fish sex movie, but I think that's slightly missing the point because obviously the creature himself, he's the least beastly of any of the characters.
Absolutely, obviously intentional.
And of course. But I mean, I saw some people say he's the most humane, but I think that gives humanity far too much credit. I think he's much more natural, and he's the most caring, kind of purest element in the film. But then second to that is Sally Hawkins' character. So I think bestiality implies sex between two animals from different species, but I would argue that they're the most similar species in the film. And there's a lovely fan theory at the end. Sorry, spoilers at the end, but when they go off, and of course when he touches the back of the neck, that they would actually be the parents for Abe from Hellboy. So Abe is this kind of human.
Wasn't he from another planet?
I'm not sure. I've watched the most recent Hellboy and it
another
confused
dimension
me.
At least?
No, maybe. Anyway, it's a lovely fan theory that they go off.
He was from around Baltimore.
But on the point of bestiality, I think you would argue, as we said before...
Yes, Ian. Continue that sentence.
To go back to where it's been accused of condoning bestiality, you could argue it does, but it wouldn't be between those two. I think you'd argue Michael Shannon's, of course, the beast of the film, and the sex scene between him and his wife is certainly much more of the act of making the beast of two backs. It's much more repulsive than the actual quite caring scene between Sally Hawkins and the creature.
The so-called humans in the film are so monstrous that anything that happens with what is defined the monster is pure and totally, I would argue again, not relatable, but understandable.
Yeah, I was going to say, the film's not subtle about this either. It's any character who is part of the establishment, part of the 1940s or 50s world view, the one who are in charge or anything, they are the monsters in this film. Anyone else who is gay, black, any sort of minority, a woman, they are the ones that are sort of viewed in the humanistic terms.
And I think this shows echoes of The Tempest, Caliban, or even The Savage from Huxley's Brave New World, where you have these ostensibly monstrous characters holding that mirror up to humanity and showing the darkness. And I think that's what we're talking about when we're looking at monster movies as metaphors.
So the film's ostensibly a romantic thriller, but the theme running throughout the film is loneliness. It's depicted visually through Eliza's sign language, and it's articulated verbally by Giles, her elderly gay neighbor. Dai, is this one of Del Toro's big themes?
Yeah, I think it's one of the more interesting things in this film, and you can see it as a sort of a connecting thread throughout his movies. And I think where this film succeeds is the establishing of the world, and it's something that we can connect in our world now that a lot of people do feel disenfranchised by mainstream whatever you want, by mainstream music, by mainstream anything. And that othering of ourselves, especially when we're teenagers, it seems to happen a lot then.
But I think this theme of loneliness we can definitely see in something like Pan's Labyrinth, where she's escaping the abusive stepfather and she takes solace in this kind of fantasy, or these monsters become her friends. And maybe I think that's something Guillermo uses a lot in his films, is this escape from loneliness into the friendship of monsters.
Into a fantasy world.
Yeah.
And the monster movie as something that it's not just depicting a creature that's destroying, but triggering the vulnerable part in us, in the audience. Everything the original monster does, like hitting with his hand, this creature in the shape of water heals. It's everything reversed. To me, when I saw it, it almost felt like the messiah of the monsters. It had kind of element of Jesus Christ. And it's not a casualty that by the end, when Michael Shannon character is facing him before being killed, then you are a god. So this movie feels like it's kind of tying up at the same time reversing the message that Western society has been giving about monsters that are warning, that are teaching, but through violence. And probably because now as a human society we're too violent, maybe we need to be taught through actions of love.
So what do you think happens to Eliza and her Amazonian fish prince, Dai?
Right, for me now, the ending of Pan's Labyrinth is ambiguous, but I choose to believe that she dies at the end. She chooses to enter the other world. Shape of Water is less ambiguous. I feel like they have a happy ending. It's a positive...
You think it's a happy ending?
I do think it's a happy ending. I think it's like a positive, uplifting sort of momentum at the end of that film, and I feel like I'd like to ride that into their future.
Would you like to ride it into the future, Ian?
I think they have hundreds of fish babies and move to Florida and open a sashimi restaurant.
Maria?
Well, one thing about this movie is that I think it brought something that was genuinely lacking in a lot of movies, which is romanticism. So I would like to say something smart, but I would like to think that they're going to be dancing, and under the water she would be singing like Fred and Ginger.
Ian, it's time for everyone's favorite part of the show, correspondence.
Okay, Marcus. Well, this week we put out the question, what are the ingredients of a great monster movie? And we had a lot of responses. And as you've told me, I'll try and be nicer to the listeners this week.
Please do.
I'll try my best. First up, we have the lovely Trig. And I had the pleasure of meeting Trig last week in Tokyo. Trig, was very nice to meet you. He says, for me, it's the rules that the film's universe follows and bends to its will, but never compromise or introduces new twists just because they need to. He said introducing a quick scare or just because has to be done extremely tongue-in-cheek. He references things like Cabin in the Woods or Evil Dead.
Is he talking about jump scares, do you think?
I think he's sort of talking about when they kind of subvert the genre they're in, or when they're doing it kind of knowingly, and I think that has to be done very carefully.
Okay.
or when it's expertly crafted, as in Alien or The Thing, for it to work within the space or the characters it's created.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, actually, because both of those films, you feel like you know the space that the characters inhabit. So you realize that there is a corner and there's something could be lurking around there.
Okay, and next up we have our lovely JC Carty. He's back again. Every show he's been on now. He says the most important ingredient is something original. He wants us to be kept in the dark for as long as possible before the big reveal. And then they should dare to show us the great visuals by shooting in the day, which is something they do in The Host, which is brilliant.
And apparently in the new Midsummer.
Oh yeah, which I've heard very good reviews.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it. It's going to be August or September here.
It's out in Britain now, so I think it's in September here. He also says, cliche as it sounds, he wants to focus on the characters, not just the visuals and sparkly effects. And that got very interesting then, because as I mentioned before, two of my old housemates are now discussing our podcast on Facebook. So Owen Miller jumps in with agreeing with JC. He said, Spielberg got it right with Jaws. Don't show the full monster until it's the perfect time. Yellow Barrel and an ominous score works just as well.
Yeah, great example.
Yeah, great. He says Daylight Monsters can work too. He scored a winner again with Jurassic Park. Who thought a rippling cup of water could build just so much tension. Another great contributor is back in Ray, who says music is a big one, but we also need a mix of practical and CGI stuff, and also always show the monster. I think it's something we discussed earlier.
And it's also the lack of sound, I think, a lot of the time. That when you don't hear anything, when things go completely silent, that's when I get most worried.
Paul Damien Ewan then chips in, who's also Ray's bandmate. He says, I think what I really enjoy is the practical effects. Robert Botton's work on John Carpenter's The Thing, and Tom Savini's work on George A. Romero's Trilogy of the Dead. And he said he couldn't quite remember whoever's behind the 1988 remake of The Blob. Does anyone remember that? They're all looking at me blankly. Sorry, Paul. He also says Stan Winston's entire back catalogue, which are brute and nightmare-inducing stuff. And what better way is there to make sure your audience... swearing. And what better way is there to make sure your audience defecates themselves when your monster shows up? I've cleaned that up for you, Paul.
Very
Thank you.
nicely done.
Dave Brown, of the surname I can pronounce, he says he loves a good monster metaphor like Godzilla rising for the fears of nuclear destruction, or even the Babadook, which I can't believe we didn't bring up. Does that count as a monster movie? I do love the Babadook. Truly, truly terrifying. Or the Babadook representing the damage that unaddressed grief can cause. And last correspondence from Nathan. He has a number of points, and Nathan, I love you, but you're a potty mouth man. I'm going to clean some of this up. Be nice to the listeners. Come on, Ian, you can do this. He says, number one, a threat that is at some level incomprehensible to us and our accepted understanding of the universe. His second point is he wants to see something unstoppable. He wants to see something that has no random weaknesses, third act defeat.
A trace of sympathy, he says, right?
Exactly, yeah.
That sounds like Nathan.
It does sound like Nathan, nihilist that he is. Number three, a monster completely without a trace of sympathy or empathy, but ideally to the point where the people are completely insignificant. He feels like a good monster movie has a threat that is existentially terrifying because it challenges our understanding of being alive and the meaning value of human life. So that's all from our lovely correspondence that I've not been rude about at all, Marcus.
Thank you very much, everybody. And finally, the same question to our panel. What are the ingredients of a great monster movie? Maria?
I personally believe in the strengths of the imagination, so I want to see the least possible of the monster itself. I want to fear about it, and as much as the technology now is top level, nothing is going to compete with what I am fearing. And the second element for me is credible characters that I can care about. So I can be genuinely afraid that they're going to be killed or not.
I will jump in there. Characters have to be strong. The more you engage with the characters, the more sympathetic they are, the more likely you are to care about what happens to them, regardless of the threat. But I also add to that, I personally love to see suspense in my monster movies. The notion that something bad is lurking and we know it's there, we the audience know it's there, but the character doesn't know it's there. That's really primal, and it's something that I really enjoy watching on the big screen. Dai?
Well, this is where I disagree with both of you, actually, because I feel like, yes, the characters are important, but if we're going to boil it down to really hammer this ingredient metaphor home, if we're going to boil it down to its single most important ingredient, it has to be the monster itself. The monster that is the single most important element in that film. If you get the monster right, if it's frightening, if it's intriguing, if it's mysterious, if it's genuinely terrifying, then everything else will slot into place. And I feel like history has borne that out.
If you don't have relatable characters, you're going to be lost, regardless of how threatening the monster is. I mean, you look at Alien versus Predator. You need somebody to relate to.
No, the problem with that film is the greatness of those two monsters cancels each other out.
Ian.
I kind of agree with everything we've said so far, but I want to go into dangerous territory and say I do kind of disagree with the not showing the monster, where in most cases I think that is a good way to go. Something like The Host, the monster's there from the opening scene, and I think because the writing's so good for the characters, it really works. So I think I'm agreeing that the characters need to be fleshed out, but I think you can show the monster if it's done well. But as Dai was saying, I do think you need a good monster. I like to see the monster early on because I want a good monster and I want it to be horrific and scary and I want the suspense. But yeah, I want my monster monstrous and I want my characters even more so.
You've been listening to The Last Picture House. Be sure to let us know what you think of the show on Twitter, where we're at Last Pick House. Follow us on Facebook or on Instagram, where we're Last Picture House, one word. And we'll be back soon with another episode.